Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about adaptations. By the way, my favorite adaptation is like these sea turtles napping on the beach. Let's talk about why adaptations are beneficial. But before we can get into that, let's talk about what an adaptation actually is. So, in biology, there are two definitions of an adaptation. One is it's a trait that gives an organism an advantage when it's trying to survive in an environment. Or we can say it's the process that produces that trait. We're mostly going to focus on the first definition. So, for example, we have an owl pictured here. Hopefully, you can see it, although it has pretty good camouflage to help it blend into that tree. Camouflage is often a survival advantage in an adaptation that allows an organism to either, if it's a predator, hide from its prey in time to surprise it and eat it, or if it's a prey species, to hide from its predator so it doesn't get eaten. So organisms adapt to their environments over time. How do they do this? Well, organisms naturally have different traits because they tend to have different genes that give them these traits, genes that are inherited usually from their parents and that they can pass on to their offspring. So here we see some sort of bivalve or clam organism, and we see some variation in its shell pattern. This can be a genetic trait that is inherited due to differences in one or more genes, and these can potentially um, come about through mutations. Now, most new traits tend to arise through mutations. Mutations are not planned out. Mutations are a random occurrence, and a lot of times mutations actually tend to be harmful or they can be neutral. It is very rare that you have a beneficial mutation that is actually helpful. Now, this becomes a problem because if you have a harmful mutation, any harmful traits can either cause organisms to die, or they can be sick or weakly and less likely to reproduce and pass on their genes. So, for example, with these clams or mollusks here, let's say that they're in an environment where this is the best color to be because they blend in to the sediment that they're trying to hide in. Everything that does not have that pattern, anything that does not have that coloration, might die off because it's a harmful trait, and any mutations that create those harmful traits would be harmful mutations. So this is where we get into natural selection. If you remember this from biology, you've got a bit of an advantage. In general, organisms tend to have more offspring, more babies than an environment can support. We're going to go into more detail on this in Unit 3 coming up in a few weeks. Now, all of these organisms can have variations in their genes that allow them to have different traits. These different traits could be something like the example you see here. So here you see some rabbits with different speeds. Now, depending on the environment that they're in, some of these traits can be beneficial, some might not have an effect on the survival of an organism, and some might be harmful. Here, if this was the original rabbit, the green guy right here, if this was one mutation to make it slower, that would be a harmful mutation. If this was another mutation to make it faster, that would be a beneficial mutation. Now, if there is a predator in this environment or something else, some factor that affects the survivability of these rabbits, that can determine whether these traits are beneficial or not. So, beneficial traits will allow an organism to survive and reproduce. Harmful traits will reduce the survival of an organism. So here we see that lower speed is a harmful trait, and that causes those rabbits to get eaten by their predator, Mr. Fox over here. These medium speed rabbits, some of them will die because they may not be fast enough to outrun the predator, but the fastest rabbits will have this survival advantage. They will survive in order to reproduce, and their offspring are likelier to survive as well. When they survive, they'll pass on these beneficial traits, and then eventually these traits will become more common in the population because everybody with the harmful trait or the less beneficial trait will have died before they could reproduce. This causes changes in the population over time. This is natural selection. Now, natural selection generally occurs via small changes at the genetic level that will build up over time. So, as an environment changes, because environments rarely stay the same forever, in fact, they never stay the same forever, they will eventually change. The traits that are actually beneficial in that environment will change as well. And these genetic changes that cause these traits to be beneficial can change incrementally or step by step. as the genetic makeup of the population changes. So here we see an example of gradual evolution. You see this original species right here. Well, some of its offspring may have had a curved beak. Other offspring may have had a slightly longer beak, and that could have given them a survival advantage. Then some of their offspring with a longer curved beak might have a survival advantage. And then there might also be some other gradual changes that lead to a longer, kind of more gradual curve in the beak that cause a survival advantage. Here you see another population where the beak ended up getting shorter. That was a survival advantage. And then the beak ended up getting even shorter until it was this much smaller beak. Now, these changes would have been gradual and built up step by step over time. A note, organisms don't develop new traits in response to changes in their environment. It's not like these organisms are sitting in an environment, the environment changes, and then the organisms think, oh my goodness, something's going to kill me. I better develop this new trait so I can adapt. No, natural selection acts on traits that are already there. So they have to already be in the population. This has a consequence. If all organisms in a population are genetically identical, they're all vulnerable to the same environmental changes, which means that if the environment changes in the right way, the whole population can be wiped out. This is going to become really important when we talk about Unit 5, especially when we get into agriculture. So let's look at these organisms right here. Let's say these are some aquatic organisms, sea urchins living in the ocean. Now, they're happy living in an environment of 25 degrees Celsius, but they are all genetically identical, and unfortunately, they have this vulnerability. When the temperature goes above 32 degrees Celsius, they will all die. So let's say global warming happens. The ocean temperatures get hotter and they reach 35 degrees Celsius. Well, since all of these urchins are genetically identical, they are all going to be killed off by this temperature change. And when that happens, you can actually have the whole population be wiped out, which can eventually lead to extinction. So there are short and long-term adaptations that can happen in a population. We tend to refer to those as microevolution, micro meaning small, and macroevolution, meaning macro meaning large. So short-term adaptations would be something like, let's say, a viral infection infects members of a population. Now, some of them may have some sort of genetic difference that allows them to be immune to or at least survive this virus. And so they will live on and be able to pass on their immunity genes, but any members of the population that don't have this genetic trait and are not immune to the virus will end up dying out. Eventually, after a couple of generations, the genetic traits of this population will change so that immunity gene becomes wider spread in the population because everybody who didn't have that immunity gene ended up dying out. That's an example of microevolution, a small scale change on a small time scale. That's a short term change. Another example is what's pictured in this diagram, and that is the evolution of wolves. Now, keep in mind, the evolution of wolves into dogs was something that was set in place by humans. That is called artificial selection or domestication. And we're going to talk more about that in Unit 5 when we talk about agriculture and growing plants. And so humans ended up breeding some wolves to develop large breeds of dogs. They ended up breeding other populations descended from wolves and started developing small breeds of dogs. And then there was some natural selection that happened, for example, from the population originally of gray wolves. Some other wolves ended up evolving traits to match their environment, and those were red wolves. They have small scale changes. This happened over a short period of time. For example, wolves were domesticated into dogs somewhere in the last 10 to 15,000 years or so. And the genetic changes are actually small enough that you can have some interbreeding between these species. For example, some breeds of dog can interbreed with wolves and produce these wolf dog hybrids. I do not recommend it. They are not tame. Then you have macroevolution. So this is long-term evolution. This is what can produce new species and produce these dramatic changes. This will usually happen over millions of years, or up to tens or hundreds of millions of years as well. So a written example here, there was a population of ancestral reptiles that gained some advantages, some adaptations in order to survive in their environment. Things like developing feathers, or having those feathers spread out on their upper limb bones to produce wings. And eventually, over millions of years, they evolved into modern day birds. This is an example of macroevolution. It took a very long time, it produced dramatic changes after a while, and it resulted in new species. The diagram example you see here are we had way back in the day, you had marine organisms that ended up evolving some changes. Some of them gained adaptations that allow them to live on land, and that's when you have the first reptiles. A small population of reptiles ended up growing fur and mammary glands and ended up evolving into modern day mammals, and a small population of those mammals ended up accumulating some changes that ultimately resulted in modern day human like species. This took a very long time. The ancestor of all modern animals that live on land, that, like reptiles, amphibians, and mammals and birds, was, I think, evolved around like 250 million years ago. And it's taken that long to accumulate all the mutations that differentiated us enough from either aquatic organisms or reptiles as humans. A lot of mutations building up to adapt to a lot of different changes in the environment. So, these environmental changes can affect the survival of a species. These environmental changes can have different timescales and kind of different speeds at which they happen. So, environmental changes can be sudden or they can be gradual. So, when the environment changes gradually over long periods of time, the adaptations that are actually beneficial change gradually, and those result in these small scale kind of gradual changes in organisms, which is called gradualism. So, here you see a species of insect, and two different populations of it went into different environments. They gradually adopted these changes that led to them ultimately developing into different species, but this happened slowly over multiple small changes building up over time. However, sometimes the environment changes dramatically. This can happen very quickly, and then the adaptations that are beneficial end up changing quickly as well. In this case, natural selection can produce sudden changes in organisms, and this is called punctuated equilibrium. So here you see a different scenario where you have this insect species and two different populations were in different environments. Those environments didn't change gradually, they changed very suddenly. And so you start seeing these dramatic changes in the species over time as they adapted to their different environments. Both of those, by the way, can happen in the course of evolution of a species. Now, in response to environmental changes, populations can do one of three things. They can change their behaviors. So, if they have beneficial traits, that can let them survive in their new environment. They can migrate to another environment if there is one close enough that they can move to that they're actually well adapted to, or they can go extinct. Now, if organisms don't have any beneficial traits that will allow them to survive in their new environment, then all the members of that species can die before they get a chance to reproduce. And when all members of a species die out, that species becomes extinct. So, what's an example of that happening? Well, 65 million years ago, an asteroid struck the Earth. Amongst some other changes, this caused some rapid climate change. For example, some ash and dirt, well, large amounts of ash and dirt got blown up into the atmosphere that ended up staying in the air for several years and blocking sunlight. A lot of producers died, and large organisms that needed a large input of food were not able to survive. Unfortunately, all of the non-avian dinosaurs fit into this category. These are the dinosaurs that were not the ancestors of modern day birds. They died out and they went extinct, which is why you can't go in your backyard and go run from a T-Rex. However, a small group of dinosaurs ended up being small. They had feathers, which would allow them to kind of retain heat since the climate changed to become cooler. And they were eventually able to develop enough, they were able to build up enough mutations that were beneficial to let them survive in the new environment. As a result of all those changes, they eventually evolved into birds. To put this in simpler terms, any species, when the environment changes, can either adapt, and a lot of times that can result in changes that will cause a species to become so different from its ancestors that it becomes classified as a new species. This is called speciation, or a species can die. This is extinction, and so all the non avian dinosaurs, like I said earlier, died out. It's as a result of this asteroid impact 65 million years ago. So, hopefully, this presentation did not cause your brain cells to go extinct and they adapted to the different conditions of, your environment absorbing a lot of information.